Ladies and gents, welcome to another episode of Hidden Perspective. This is Rob Greco. It's good to be back. Just a quick preview as to what's to come. Jules and I had a very interesting discussion on Kevin Rudd, Australia's former Prime Minister's recent appearance in the Senate, where he asks for an investigation into the Murdoch media monopoly. It's a juicy and wide-ranging discussion, especially towards the end there where we touch on some related topics, which we had a lot of fun discussing. So all in all, we hope you enjoy the discussion as much as we did. They're still not allowing touring in Australia?
You can tour, but like it's just a massive head fuck because you know everything gets derailed and you might get stuck in a different part of the country, not be allowed to go home.
Yeah.
Like
Anth had a trip planned to Noosa, and he went last week. He was meant to go with a couple of different couples, and they just bailed last minute because they just didn't want to get stuck there. I think one of the girls was pregnant and just understandably didn't want to get stuck in Noosa, stranded while she was pregnant. In Canada, Europe, America, I'm sure it's looked at as this is this amazing post-COVID place. And then I hear the stories from all my Australian friends, see the Australian media, people are just being stranded from their homes. This complete dichotomy in media. Have you been?
Yeah.
But you've been traveling. You were in Tasmania.
I was in Tasmania. Yeah, I mean, I had free accommodation. You know, if I got stuck there, I would have had a nice bedroom to myself. And
yeah,
in Ned's new North Hobart Palace. So that made it, more comfortable. I was less nervous about getting stuck there. But the COVID thing, JobKeeper's about to end. And I just don't understand how all the live music venues are going to fucking survive. I do not understand. So,
how many people also, can you have at a live music venue?
The CBDs, all the CBD venues and
are still closed.
Fucking cafes and all this shit. They're just going to, as this JobKeeper thing approaches, all these musicians that were previously touring and gigging and getting paid all these festivals, all these people who serviced festivals and all the lighting guys, all this, there's just the amount of work that is in the music industry compared to what there was, and the scale of those events is so fucking small. I just don't understand how JobKeeper can. I don't know what the fuck's going to happen to all these people.
Yeah. Did you see what Texas did? Just completely ripped off the Band-Aid. They're like, all right, fuck it. No masks, no mask mandate. We're 100% open. This was a couple of weeks ago. They had the reasoning was they had more than 50% of people above the age of 65 who had already been vaccinated. And they're like, all right, well, anyone who's going to use the hospital, well, most of the people who are going to use the hospital should be fine now. So let's just rip it off. And then all these comedians, like live performers, they all have shows in Texas now. Everyone in, all the creators have been booking shows in Texas, and it's surprising that Melbourne didn't do that. They didn't just say
Band-Aid off.
And just be let creatives make money again.
Look, I think they're waiting. I'm sure they're waiting for a vaccine. The problem is, if they're one fuck up at hotel quarantine, which is of course, bound to happen with the incredible professionalism of our state bureaucracy, and that fucker goes to, I don't know, a big room and bang, everyone's got COVID and, instead of being,
it's a real trade-off,
And now any case higher than zero means you're basically locked down till you're back to zero. So
we see that. Do you know how funny it is? Have chats with my parents. They're like, oh, how's COVID going in Canada? You're like, yeah, we're going really well. We're about to enter stage 3 of our reopen phase. How many cases do you have? Oh, we still get 500 cases a day. It's just they have a fucking heart attack. What? 500 cases? That's really low. That's a green light for us. It's a completely different strategy.
Yeah, well, and I mean, look, it's definitely, I'm sure the last 4 months of living here have been way better than your last 4 months. So, but then we had 6 months.
They have.
Yeah. But then, we had, at least in Melbourne, we had, 6 months of utter hell. So.
Yeah. Well, I think ideal is Taiwan, right? No lockdown, no real change of reality. Queensland, they haven't really had a lockdown apart from the first one. They had like a minor one, but anyway. Jules, the man Ruddos has been back in the news. Did you catch his appearance in the Senate?
I did. I was avoiding doing work and watched all of it.
Yeah. I know I'm a bit late because I think that was 3 weeks ago. I also did a podcast on that about 2 months ago, and that was but like it's my podcast, so we get to talk about whatever we want. But yeah, he's back. He's asked for a royal commission. Definitely not going to get a royal commission, but got some type of Senate inquiry. He was in it. He was fielding questions from people from all parties. He was talking about this cancer on democracy, also known as Rupert Murdoch. So, I mean, he's back. He's looking good with the beard, hey? With the Gandalf beard. Did you have any thoughts on how you thought about his presentation of his case? What do you make of it?
Yeah, I reckon I'm nervous about Murdoch, and I'm nervous about the incredibly strong link there seems to be between Scott Morrison and this Liberal government and Murdoch. I find Murdoch's alignment to the resources industry and just general, whoever's got a concern around climate reform. And I find that the power that he wields and leverages, particularly in parts of the country that have more swinging voters, to be a worry, And I guess I had a good chat with Ned about this as well. It's like, what's the appropriate? Like, it's one thing to say, and we can talk about this. A, is there actually a problem? And then B, if there is a problem, is there any actual solution that's acceptable? And that's a little bit more complicated than if there is a problem or not.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, the problem as Rudd sees it, I kind of touched on that when I did the Murdoch episode, but he basically has like 4 claims. The first one is that Murdoch has 70% print ownership. The second claim being that, the last 18 out of the 18 federal and state elections, Murdoch papers all endorse the Liberal Party. Claim 3 being that he has loss-making newspapers to maximize political power. So it's not really like a commercial enterprise. It's a political enterprise. And claim number 4 is that his journalists engage in bullying behavior, and they can essentially castigate and shame any politician who dares take a different opinion from Murdoch, and essentially leading them into silence. And that's how he wields political power. So that, I mean, like, all in all, when I look at Kevin Rudd presenting, I'm kind of like nodding my head 90% of the time. But then I'm like, there's something about what he's saying that I don't 100% agree with. And then when I look at like Murdoch apologists or people on the right who like have their views, and they say that, it's sour grapes on the part of Rudd, and, he's just salty that Murdoch didn't give him a fair hearing at like, the end of his prime ministership, and talking about it as if there's no problem. I think to myself, you're kind of wrong as well. Like, there's some type of middle ground, which I think we'll get to, where like I think everyone, all the positions that have been canvassed in the debate now are kind of wrong. So, I mean, the first one is like, a claim of 70% print ownership. So, in and of itself, you'd say that's pretty worrying, Jules?
Yeah. And Rudd fleshing that out was persuasive when he spoke about how print media dictates the mainstream media narrative.
So let me toss something up at you. I find the overall premise that, the greater your percentage of media concentration, the greater political power. If you put it on a spectrum and you had one newspaper and you're in CCP China, where they can essentially control the press and you only have one voice, that's bound to be a problem. Then on the other side of the spectrum, if you had, just independence, thousands of different voices. Maybe it's also another kind of problem because everyone operates in their own echo chamber and there's no sense of shared reality. So there's probably like somewhere in the middle of those, which is probably healthy for a democracy, which is at least Kevin Rudd's goal. So, I mean, 70% ownership, the thing I wanted to push back against you is like, firstly, it's not really 70% ownership because he does this thing where he says print ownership. So it's true that in print newspapers, Murdoch might own 70%. But if you look at the whole media landscape, you include radio, TV and everything like that, it's more closer to like around about 60%, but still 60%. But the other thing I try to understand is it in and of itself wrong if it's just a newspaper that's better able to connect with readers who buy that, right? If genuinely 60% of Australians like Murdoch papers, what's the problem?
Well, instinctively, I've sort of got two arguments. First would be, couldn't you say the same thing about any monopoly? And, you could say, a monopoly that's able to squeeze its suppliers is better for the consumers because they can, so you could argue Coles and Woolies do a great
That's
job
an argument
of
that people
driving.
do make, yeah.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
That, so, and then you'd say, well, it's not enough that it's not acceptable that Coles and Woolies drive prices down. Yes, it's good for consumers because milk ends up super cheap, but this is really an unfair consequence because the market powers meant dairy farmers go broke, as an example, right? So I'd say that that's the first thing. I think a monopoly is that someone gets burnt somewhere along the chain. Might not be the direct consumer, but someone gets burnt when there's a monopoly and an unfair level of power.
Yeah.
And secondly, I'd say, and this is a little bit more abstract, but people's level of agency is not that high in regards to media and news. And I feel like people's attachment to reading the paper is a cultural internalization and a historical internalization. And it's like, and this might mean, this argument doesn't necessarily mean that it's acceptable for the government to intervene, but it's like media has this really important responsibility in establishing common facts and holding important institutions to account. And I feel like if you live in Queensland and there's the only newspapers that exist are Murdoch papers, and you're someone who likes to buy the paper, like what I'd say back to you, Rob, is like, it's not that these people love necessarily Murdoch newspapers. Right. It's that they just like buying the newspaper. And at the moment, he's the only one who's got this endless amount of cash to continue to lose money on this failing industry, but to maintain control of those people's opinions and political views.
Yeah. So the first one about the monopoly, do we like having someone with such significant market power? The answer is like, it really depends how they use that market power. So the test the ACCC would have is, you can have market power. It's okay. We want you to be successful, and we're not gonna criminalize someone for becoming Amazon just because they're that big. There are actually even some benefits of having someone like Amazon in terms of efficiencies and consumer welfare, and you get things for cheap. And, for goodness sake, like last week, I ordered something and it literally arrived in an hour. So, there's something about scale that's actually really, really nice. But it becomes an issue when they misuse that power. And the ACCC is looking at that, and you could make a case that they're not aggressive enough in pursuing these monopolies. But I think one thing that's important to stress is when they do talk about media concentration in the digital platforms inquiry a couple of years ago, that's this inquiry that the ACCC undertook, this huge report, but it was in the title, was the problem? The digital platform inquiry. So for the ACCC, at least in their eyes, a person who has a much greater potential misuse of monopoly power are Google and Facebook. So that's where their attention is focused. So complaining about a Murdoch monopoly when you have a much bigger monopoly, and if you even look at the stats on the amount of information that's controlled online, at least something like 70% of that is through Facebook and Google, and Murdoch has a tiny fraction of that. So I would say that they would consider Murdoch to be a problem if they weren't bigger fish to fry. Second point you raised is that, the cultural phenomenon of buying a paper. Yeah, I kind of agree with you. I agree with you, but then I would also push back and I would say it's only relevant insofar as that cultural institution remains relevant, which I think is a dying industry. So I think a criticism of Rudd would be, yeah, you've kind of identified a really bad problem, which is that, people, they love papers, and if they only have one paper, then they're going to naturally gravitate towards a political view of the editor. But there's a shrinking share of people who are actually engaging in that cultural phenomenon. So I would say that the market is naturally correcting against that. And if you look at someone like Friendly Geordies, independent, left-leaning YouTuber, has 500,000 subscribers. That's almost on par with the greatest print readership in Australia, which is the Australian, just above, 500,000. 500,000. So, yes, a problem, but is it Armageddon? And is the market already kind of correcting for that in a digital world where that traditional media landscape is crumbling? I would say yes.
Yeah. So I agree with all of that. I guess the only other thing I'd add is Rudd talking about how print media is able to dictate narratives across the media landscape.
Mm-hmm.
And I think part of his analysis was that mainstream television basically pick up the major stories from the newspapers.
Yeah.
And that also the major newspapers are able to create a cycle of content and follow-up content.
Yeah.
That ultimately a lot of these more independent media participate in.
Mm.
So it's even though they're not necessarily being viewed by a lot, they're actually controlling and dictating a lot of the narrative. They don't even need to
sell 100% of the papers, but they'll get to shape 100% of the papers because they go first.
Not even the papers. The point is
the whole landscape.
Television, the whole landscape. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's a strong argument, but I would say wouldn't that always exist? Wouldn't you always have one person that's going to have slightly greater market share than someone else? And isn't that almost like a position that you inherently occupy if you're the biggest? You get to, if you're the biggest, you probably have the highest amount of contacts with political insiders. Political insiders also probably want to talk to you first because you have the biggest. And just as a natural result of being the most dominant media firm, you get that ability. So it's a problem, but it's also something that every media organization signs up for when they enter the industry. And I think we're going to get to that. It's a problem, but what do you do with it? That's the question. So yeah, you're always going to have someone who dominates a market. And by virtue of them dominating, they're always going to set the agenda. How do you even begin to address that?
Well, for starters, should Channel 9 have been able to buy Fairfax?
Right.
And, should Murdoch have been able to buy all that Associated Press, whatever it was called?
And interesting,
the whole rural newspapers and all that.
And interesting tidbit, when Murdoch in the late 80s was given permission by Hawke Keating for the merger, that he bought one of Fairfax's old papers in Melbourne, right? And funnily enough, Keating allowed it on the grounds that he thought Murdoch represented this new money that was going to get rid of these old these old interests, these like old Melbourne money interests that were controlling Fairfax at the time. So he actually saw Murdoch as this reinvigorating force in media. And it's just interesting to note that, because that was only, 3 decades ago. And now Murdoch has been seen as like the old, stale interests that are kind of dominating. So, there has been some activity and some like reshuffling of the deck in terms of who controls what in media over time.
Yeah, and like hope, and you'd expect it to continue to shift. Facebook, Google, important independent people, all of that's a positive thing. Before we talk about how you'd solve this problem, if there is a problem, I reckon there's two other ways of framing it that are more favourable to Rudd's perspective. The first is framing it from the position of the two prime ministers, so Kevin Rudd and Malcolm Turnbull.
Yeah.
So obviously a Labor and a Liberal prime minister, both saying that they felt dictated to by the power of Murdoch. And in the case of Malcolm Turnbull, explicitly. Right. That's so you can say, is it a problem? So the question becomes pretty simple there. Is it a problem that prime ministers feel like they can't implement the policies they want because of one particularly important person in the country?
Yeah. This is something where I'm like, Rudd, you got me. That was a good point. You can't deny the fact that if you have multiple prime ministers feeling like the existence of their prime ministership, the legitimacy of their prime ministership lasts on what one media mogul thinks. And on top of that, people would tell me I'm a conspiracy theorist if I said that, did you realize that the conversation of two billionaires determined who would be Australia's prime minister, as happened with the phone call between Kerry Stokes and Rupert Murdoch in 2018, I believe, when Turnbull had to step down, or could have been earlier than that. But when Turnbull had to step down, there was it's been reported and it's been verified that there was a conversation that took place between two media mogul billionaires that after a week led to a different prime minister. If you didn't know any better, you'd say, Rob, you're a fucking crackpot. You assigned way too much value to conspiracies. But that did happen, right?
Yeah.
And that's Australia, one of the most advanced democracies in the world. We had a phone call between two rich media mogul billionaires that determined who was our prime minister. And am I oversimplifying that?
I don't think so, because you can. And then this is my broader point, and this maybe speaks to the dysfunctional nature of politics all around the world. But as far as I'm concerned, Australia has become a non-reform enterprise. Certainly, at least with the federal government. So there's probably been, and any time any major lobby group has wanted to defeat a significant policy change in Australia,
right,
it gets defeated. So the way that this is old politics for some people now. We're probably really old, Rob. My sister and stuff wouldn't know anything about this probably, but when
my sister better be listening to this. She's really into politics, Year 12 politics. But Steph, you better be listening. Yeah.
Listen to two straight white cis men talk.
None of that on this podcast.
This discussion is inherently invalid. Anyway, but
she's
in
not
all
as woke
seriousness,
as her contemporaries. Go on.
So Kevin Rudd, wants to implement a mining reform, carbon emissions reform, and this absolute juggernaut of lobby groups just smashes it to bits. And then Julia Gillard later on, as part of her agreement with those independents to form government, was compelled through that agreement to implement pokies reform. Smashed. So, the question is, why does the lobby groups that Murdoch, why is Murdoch always, it doesn't seem like Murdoch's able to get state Liberal governments elected, but he does seem to be able to destroy policy.
Federal Labor, yeah.
He does seem to destroy policy, and whether it's Liberal policy, Turnbull hoping to do something on the environment,
right,
hoping to do something on reform, smashed. So I see Murdoch Press and its alignment to big corporations being a problem. But then the thing is, it seems to be a bigger problem when it's just one media entity. But the truth is, right, that ultimately, because money is held inside these big corporations, they could still exercise the same level of control over the media and have the media galvanize over their lobbying simply by being significant advertisers across a more diverse media landscape. Yeah. Which is to say that media is inherently propagandist.
Yeah.
And it's always going to be leveraged by big money-making corporations to stifle policy reform that isn't in their interests.
Yeah.
That's just always going to be the case. So,
I agree with that. And it was good that you closed off that point, because for a second there I was going to say, is it Murdoch in and of itself and Murdoch's power in and of itself that determines the fact that there's, weak action on climate change, no action, according to some, if there's, all these policy measures that aren't being put forward. And a counterpoint is, because Rudd always cites that, New Zealand and Canada, of the Five Eyes, are the two countries where Murdoch doesn't operate, and they have much more progressive policy. But to which I would say, I'm living in Alberta, Canada, and to push forward on environmental regulation is very fucking difficult. And it's very fucking difficult because so many working class interests are tied to oil and gas here in Alberta. This, richest province in Canada, oil and gas, not going to bode well for the province if we completely switch away from fossil fuels. But, the fact that we kind of go back and forth in Alberta on the carbon tax, yes, carbon tax, no carbon tax, we don't get clear green policy in the province, is not because we have a Murdoch. It's just because a lot of interests are also tied up with that. And so I think that was a good point, which is that, by definition of companies existing, this is like a point that Noam Chomsky makes in the propaganda model, is if you always have big corporations which fund the media, there's always going to be a pro-business bias in whatever the media produces, because if they write something unfavorable and they do that time and time again, well, people are going to stop advertising, and there's going to be a drying up of funds. And ultimately, these are for-profit entities, and these media organizations depend on some type of business to keep them going. So, yeah, I think you raise a good point. Is it in and of itself Murdoch, or is it always going to be a problem if you have for-profit media?
Yeah, no, exactly. And it's if anyone's, that thoughtful piece of analysis you've presented is totally congruent with what happens in Australia. Compare Australia's current climate position to that of the Conservative Party in Britain. Right?
Yeah.
The Conservative Party in Britain nearly 10 years ago was, I think maybe longer than 10 years ago, was participating in significant climate change reform, emissions trading schemes, etc.
Right.
What's the obvious reason that Australia can't take a functional climate policy, emissions trading position in Australia? We're one big fucking huge hole in the ground.
Yeah.
It's there's just way too much money made here from pillaging and exploiting the environment. And ultimately, I agree with you, Rob. It's the money made, not necessarily Murdoch. But Murdoch's his conduit, right?
Yeah.
And I guess what Rudd would say is that Murdoch is a conduit for the interests of big business, as any media organization would be. But then because he's consolidated things so intensely, he's also able to exercise his own political will and his own political preferences.
Yeah.
And that's where it's like, that's where it's difficult, and it's
a tough problem. I think I think we tied a bow on that pretty well. But I mean, there is this other point which we kind of mentioned in passing about, I kind of mentioned, is it much of a concern if we're talking about an industry which is largely dying anyway? So, consolidation is an inevitable byproduct of any shrinking industry, right? If an industry is shrinking up, there are less profits to be made. People going out of business. Bigger companies will buy those smaller companies and consolidate to salvage whatever's left. So, how do you feel about that general shift in media that's taking place, which might exacerbate the percentage of ownership, and Murdoch might seem to have more and more. But if it is a shrinking share of an industry that's becoming increasingly irrelevant, I'll give everyone an example. So I read the other week a book by Marshall McLuhan, and he was talking about media in the 1800s in the States, and how the very first newspaper, when it started out, had a print circulation of one edition a month, right? It felt that the first newspaper in the States felt that it could only produce enough news to fill up one print edition a month, right? Now, if you were to extrapolate that forward, in other words, what we're saying is 29 out of 30 days when we get newspaper, when we get updates, when we get anything that we're consuming is total BS. The media industry has been selling entertainment packaged as news. So, we're treating it as if the industry in itself has largely been serious, but it's largely been a joke, and it's probably been a joke for a long time. And I mean, maybe it's a repackaged joke now that looks kind of a little bit stupid, but we're being so serious about an industry that doesn't really give us fucking, informational nourishment to begin with.
Here. Yeah, and that's that. I mean, ultimately, when I've spoken about this and when I've thought about it harder, and when I took some reflection after listening to Kevin Rudd speak, it was, while he's really persuasive, and while it's very tempting to hate the hell out of Murdoch, and you probably should, it ultimately, it's the dysfunctional nature between human beings, propaganda, and whatever this idea of what media is that creates the climate for this to happen. Because ultimately, most media is a piss take. And really, the exciting thing about the information age, and in a way, what was previously media's core responsibility, that is to report on facts, is sort of no longer necessary. It's kind of gone. If you want to know what happens in a particular court case, you go online and you can pull up the minutes, right?
Minutes, the transcript, the live stream.
Yeah, the live stream.
Available. Yeah.
You want to find out what was discussed at at Rio Tinto's annual board meeting. You go online, you pull up the minutes. You want to know what a certain business is doing and what they've decided to action. You can probably just go on their Twitter account or their Facebook page or their own internal website. I mean, everyone's able to now publish information, stream information live. It's there. And people's ability to lie about things is now infinitely diminished, because you might 50 years ago you might publish something that was a lie, and then it might only be found to be a lie maybe a couple of weeks later, and then it takes how long to let everyone know that it was a lie or whatever. Now if you lie, it can be anyone who knows can so quickly call it out and to let the whole world know that you can't really lie anymore. So it seems to me that
Yeah, go on.
It seems to me that as we've now got this direct this direct access to facts and information
Yeah.
from direct sources, that core responsibility of media needing to deliver facts
It's
to
kind of
everyone.
comical, right?
Well, it's kind of gone. Like you could argue, I've thought about this a little bit. You could argue that, well, it's unrealistic to expect people with full-time work and children and whatever else to sit there and, go examine a direct source document every time they want to know something about what's happening.
Right.
So you could say, media then becomes this summary, like modern media is like this summary of facts.
Yeah.
Right. So it's like, and this summary of what happened in the court case, because you're not going to read the whole minutes, or the summary of what happened in the board meeting, or the summary of what happened in the Senate inquiry and what happened in Parliament, etc. So you could say, okay, so media is now becoming less about here's what happened, more about here's like a summary of what happened. And in that opportunity, or in that function, lies an opportunity for media to be, again, deceptive and biased and whatever else. But ultimately, we're in such a good position to do more of this stuff ourselves. And I think we need to acknowledge how much media is just this dysfunctional, crappy entertainment.
Yeah, totally. 2 points on that. So yeah, the first is that Julian Assange would say that all commentary is censorship. That's his kind of point, and the underlying premise of WikiLeaks is that you don't need anyone to tell you exactly what a source document meant when you can just fucking read the document. There's that point. And then the second point is that I couldn't agree more with the idea that there's this growing irrelevance of the inherent need of media. So there's this great new book. A lot of people have been talking about it in kind of I don't know, tech circles, is The Revolt of the Public and the Crisis of Authority by Martin Gurry. He's an ex-CIA analyst, and he would say that institutions have completely lost any grasp of reality. That's why public trust in politicians is at a historical low. There's just no way to know anything, because back when he was a CIA analyst back in the the 80s and 90s, if he wanted to learn what the opinion in France of a particular US policy was, he would go to two newspapers, the two most trusted newspapers in France. He would look at the editorial board. He would say, yes, policy is favorable, not favorable, and he would report back, and the CIA would use this. He said at the point at which the internet became democratized, freely available, there's a complete lack of legitimacy in anything that he would report that comes from the editorial board, because the public, there's such a demarcation between what the public actually thinks and believes and what the editorial board is spinning. And then a third point on that is that, I think if you look at the revenue source in media organizations, typically they were funded by Classified ads, right? They would fund exactly. They would fund a large portion of the revenue that a media organization would make, and they could run all the other articles from that. Now, if you're looking for an ad, you're not going to a newspaper. You're going to, if you're looking for a job, you go to Seek. If you want to find something online, you go to Marketplace, eBay, whatever. There are all these other places where that industry is gone, and it's completely crippled the revenue source, but what it's also done, it's freed up a lot of the paper to be selling editorial opinion. So now, previously where you'd get all these news reports and maybe one page on an editorial board, if you go on the New York Times website, on the right-hand side, they have their 20 columnists, and they produce a lot of the value that people are getting, and it's just opinions of, kind of a lot of the times elitist, snooty, pretentious people who live in New York, right?
Culture wars. Yeah, yeah, okay. So because information's now so much better circulated, you're saying that media's intensified its editorial divisions and basically
it has, yeah.
Yeah. Well, that makes sense. And again, it's I don't read much, but I if I'm going to consume some content, you know, the absolute last place I ever want to spend time doing is watching the news, right? Or reading the newspaper. Like,
right.
You know,
Right.
Yeah. Unless I want to work out how, you know, what's the big fucking lie today. I don't
hate read the newspaper. I read it to see how that's idiotic like some opinions are being packaged.
And this is why it's a good thing that this industry is dying. It's just what's going to take its place is just, you know, it's like at the same time though, it's like see this is my concern. My concern is, and this is a little bit culture wars, a little bit not. I don't know. Take it or leave it. But if we look at the seemingly successful progressive movements happening, say if we took, you know, countries like Australia, New Zealand, Canada, America, the UK, more broadly Europe, you know, the current important issues or the issues that are taking up a lot of time and we're seemingly winning. So things like, you know, trans rights, gay rights,
right.
Racism, feminism, these kind of big social issues, they seem to get an amazing amount of press, be unbelievably well circulated, and, you know, seem to certainly have succeeded in totally transforming cultural domains like music, art, movies, television.
Mm-hmm.
Totally shifted in like 15 years the kind of movies are acceptable to make now and the whole mainstream depiction of certain races and things, and
right.
most of that's probably a good thing. But here's what I'd say.
But it's also crazy how you can watch a movie that's just 10 years old and you can be shocked by how, you know, racist it feels or insensitive it feels, but be completely amazed that you didn't think that at all 10 years ago. Like degree, yeah. So whether we call that progress or whether we call that overreaction, maybe somewhere in the middle, I don't know.
Yeah, I think so. Look, I you know, it's important that we don't treat people like shit for arbitrary reasons. So you know, I think for most of it is cool. You know, there's censorship and stuff that I have a problem with, and you know, don't want to get into the culture wars. But what I would say is this.
We'll save a few episodes for that.
What I'd say is that it doesn't seem to me that this massive democratization of media is resulting in anything that's aiming to challenge the amazing stockpile of wealth that a tiny part of the population has. It doesn't seem to be directly instigating any kind of class warfare, which, you know, because we're supposed to be entering this post-media environment that, you know, if you, as you were saying before, your media was inherently pro-business. And it's like, well, why isn't this new media, you know, allowing an ecology for someone like Bill Shorten and his policy agenda to succeed? Like, why wasn't that possible? Was it because he's a
fragmented
really,
way? I have a hypothesis, but
I'll
let you finish that point.
Yeah, and I guess you could argue, well, you know, Biden's been elected or whatever, but to me, it doesn't seem it isn't, at least anyway, materializing in a culture that's super interested in taking care of the environment and destabilizing the incredible inequity and wealth that's happening in these countries. If anything, in the last 20 years, wealth inequality has grown exponentially, certainly in Australia,
right? Certainly
in the States. So,
the Western
you know, we don't, like, you know, we're getting really good at cancelling people for being racist and sexist and transphobic or whatever. But we don't seem to be doing anything or doing anywhere near as well at cancelling people for environmental damage and succeeding in changing the narrative around how we actually start to make society fairer and start dealing with this incredible inequity in wealth. So
yeah, I mean, in short, to quickly say, I would say a lot of those cancellations are actually a net negative, but I think we can get to that. I think we can get to that in another episode. But I think there are two things going on. I think the first thing is, and people might say this is like a Koch brothers plot or a Murdoch plot or whatever, but I don't have any evidence for this, but that social progress on so-called social or cultural issues was allowed precisely because it would fragment the left and the constituency needed to serve working class interests. But I think, and so whether that was deliberately done or deliberately allowed, or it's just the way it evolved, I don't know. But the reason why you're unlikely to get some type of left-leaning majority in media is because it triangulates three core left-leaning interests, which are working class interests, environmental interests, and social interests. So if I was someone who was of the working class, I am not going anywhere near an outlet like BuzzFeed. Why would I? They wouldn't really support working class interests. Political correctness actually penalizes people of the working class because they don't go to university to learn what is and what isn't acceptable thought. And so you inherently alienate people who are left-leaning people. Like if I think of, maybe someone like my uncle, he's been, a member of one of Australia's largest trade unions for his pretty much his entire working life. He would, I don't know for a fact, but he would probably vote double Labor every time. But he would much prefer reading something like a Murdoch paper because he doesn't have to put up with some woke-ass politics. And he also doesn't have to put up with potentially environmental regulation, which would maybe cut him out of a job, or not him personally, but you can imagine someone in like an industry like mining who might be in favor of working class interests wouldn't read a left-wing outlet who's promoting environmental regulation and who's posting stuff about wokeness. So I think there's been this, there's this inherent this unholy trinity of left-wing interests that means you never get a sizable paper, you never get a political force that can unite people on broad-stroke left-wing interests because a lot of them tend to contradict. And I think, I think that's just something whether I don't know how to solve that. I don't know exactly what that means, and I don't know if it was like a Koch brothers plot or a Murdoch plot or anything like that. I just know that there's this inherent tension between a lot of these left-leaning interests that probably doesn't allow for, as you say, like reform on inequality or working class improvements or anything like that. And I would say one more thing is that a lot of the people who pioneer a lot of these woke interests, a lot of people who pioneer a lot of these environmental methods actually happen to not be working class and actually happen to probably benefit from a system that doesn't fight for those working class interests. These are probably people who own property. These are probably people who have some type of power, and they indirectly benefit from the system. So why would they challenge it?
That was a brilliant little summary, Rob.
The thing about, elite interest, elite versus non-elite, working class versus bourgeoisie, whatever you want to frame it as, you kind of get it in glimpses, but it's like a fragile, fleeting story. So it might be something like GameStop, where people pretend that it's working class people trading shares in their basement who are taking on hedge funds. And then you might generate this anti-establishment energy, and you might think oh, we're at some type of turning point. We're gonna, fuck over the bankers. We're gonna fuck over the 1%. It's time for the little man to step up. But a story like that can so easily get, completely conflated because it actually wasn't that at all. You actually had hedge funds versus hedge funds, and a lot of the people who were benefiting from something like GameStop were actually hedge funds who were also inflating the price. So even when you get glimpses of a story that is working class versus elites, you get a little bit, you get a couple of days and it seems like this amazing turnaround. It seems like, the March on Wall Street, I forget, Occupy Wall Street, but then it completely disappears. And is that on purpose? Is that, the powerful controlling us, or is that just the fact that there's no wholesome left-leaning constituency to keep up that energy?
So are we then talking about media?
I brought up that point in the context of I can understand why someone like Murdoch dominates, is because it's much easier to sell some type of right-wing coalition of voices, pro-business, anti-culture war issues, anti-PC, anti-environmental regulation, and get more than 50% of people to buy that paper than it is to do the inverse, where you have to sell pro-woke, pro-political correctness, pro-environmental regulation, and pro-working class interests. I think you have this unholy trinity, this unholy alliance that's always going to contradict each other, and you're not going to be able to sell a paper that satisfies all those constituencies. Which is why all those papers are fucking fragmented. You look at like BuzzFeed, Huffington Post, The Age, which isn't really that anymore. It's more of like a center-right paper. Like Guardian. The Guardian, it's like, these papers are fragmented, and like, do you have like a working class paper? You don't really, because they can't really, unify energy and unify customers around that.
Yeah.
Crikey. Well, that's like all these like small papers, right?
It's yeah. I think the analysis you've given is really, really important and really accurate. And it's, I guess my question is, a lot of the forces that are dictating the environment you're talking about seem to stem from people's content and people's opinions ultimately being very self-serving. And it's like, what can we expect anything else other than powerful interests being able to optimize whatever media ecosystem exists,
right,
for their own benefit, in a situation where people aren't able to sit down, participate in genuine inquiry, and ultimately have care for preferences and possibilities that aren't just in their short-term best interests, like working class people not being able to get behind environmentalism because it implicates their jobs. I mean, you'd really, really think and hope that most countries that are at least well off are in a position to help transition people into employment that protects them from the negative consequences of the environmental change. Like, surely, we can subsidize most of that.
Money doesn't mean anything now, Jules. What are you talking about? You've had fucking 50 trillion pumped into the economy in the last year.
Well, exactly. You can just keep everyone we can't afford to keep the people who work at fucking,
There's no such thing as inflation anymore.
Aluminium refractories. Exactly. And we don't have the money to pay for that, but we've got the money to pay for all this. I mean, I don't know. It's just, to me, it seems unbelievably convenient. And as that the culture wars have just created this incredible sense of, like, I would say most people would point to the way that the culture wars have basically taken over mainstream society and media
as a huge fucking distraction.
Well, you could call it, you would frame it as a huge fucking distraction. I would too.
With parts of genuine progress, but got amplified to a degree that wasn't aligned with the actual progress. But we'll get into that.
but that, maybe we should talk more about that, because that's kind of more interesting. Because like a good example would be, there's a lot of women being abused is a big thing on social media and stuff at the moment, right?
That's something that I would say is a legitimate issue and a legitimate reckoning. So like, I wouldn't want to conflate what I'm thinking of with that.
No, definitely not. But like, it frustrates me that, I don't think anything in regards to, say, pokey reform would have been trending in the bloody time that I've been alive. And I don't think anyone in media has thought about, say, pokey reform, since Gillard, since it was a big political issue, since there was going to be serious federal reform into pokies, right? Now, if you are cross-check gambling and domestic violence, it's it's enormous, right? Gambling destroys families, turns people to criminality, and a lot of these men who are suffering pokey addiction and gambling addiction end up creating an environment where they abuse women in their lives. Now, it's totally unacceptable, but the point is, if we stopped pillaging working class, disadvantaged communities with things like the pokies, with things like this dysfunctional war on drugs. I mean, the relationship between drugs, drug abuse, and alcohol abuse, and how that correlates to men abusing the women in their lives is also unbelievably high. And if we were able to get inside communities and implement reforms that improved the economic welfare and the negative consequences of these addictions, we could massively, I think, improve more than anything else, improve outcomes for a lot of women. And of course, women who end up in really awful life situations, if they're addicted to drugs, alcohol, pokies, they end up in awful situations. Everyone does who ends up in those situations, but we don't. It doesn't seem to be like so much of this. It's like we're constantly. I feel like we're constantly shooting rubber bullets. Yeah. It's like I don't understand. I don't understand how people can't seem to see this incredible disconnect between how well circulated and well established within the mainstream people's care for these issues is, these social issues, but then there just doesn't seem to be any set of policies that correlates these issues to class and equity and then sees them being able to be successfully implemented. I mean, I understand how better educating boys at school will improve consent issues and sexual abuse issues, right? Like I understand that, but I also then, if you actually check the data and you see the amount of abuse that happens to people in poor socioeconomic situations, it's unbelievably higher, right? And it's like...
Yeah. And if you also, you can manipulate the data in a way that benefits a headline, but if you looked at, like domestic violence as a broad category of, partner violence and, sibling violence and all the various forms of violence, you would see that, roughly 50% of the victims also happen to be men. So it's almost like, you could frame it in a culture war-y type of way, and like pro-women, pro-trans, pro-gay or whatever, because maybe that sells, and maybe it's like people get energized by it, and people get energized by a headline, or people get energized by, some type of cultural issue because they see themselves on either, pro or against. But does it, is there a market for, proper journalism that actually proposes reform that would actually solve the problem? Maybe that's a bit more nuanced and boring and a grey area that no newspaper really wants to touch because who's going to sell that?
Exactly. It's not as simple as, and that's right. It's not as simple as being able to pick a side and get angry at someone. And again, this goes back to like, would it matter? We can tie it back to Murdoch. Would it matter at all if Murdoch was there, or if Murdoch was dispersed and the government came in and made him divvy it up or whatever? Would that change the fact that media is always going to be
a bucking of the trend? Yeah.
Yes. Is media always going to want to frame things in simple narratives with good characters and evil characters, bad sides and good sides, and also divert away from people having to consider real things, real inquiries, and understand that wanting to make a change in the world often involves trade-offs. And you can't just get all the good things about your social perspective without maybe having to pay a little bit more tax, or maybe having a little bit less cheap things in the world because we're not polluting the environment as much, and changes actually cost things, and it's like, you look at how unbelievably well circulated something like the Invasion Day marches are, and good, like it's a good thing that people are wanting to will this country to stop being A, denialistic about its history, and B, so ineffective at delivering social opportunities and economic opportunities for Indigenous people. But this, when Rio Tinto or BHP or whatever destroy a sacred site.
Yeah.
Or when
violates land rights of tribes.
Like, why isn't it just like why isn't my Instagram as activated,
populated with that, right?
As this Christian Porter stuff. This Christian Porter stuff. Yes, okay, I believe her. Good, that's good. But why isn't the same energy like get your super money out of BHP, get your super money out of Rio? They just destroyed the sacred site, and that just massively propagate. Like why doesn't the Premier, when he decides to build a fucking highway through these sacred birthing trees, get cancelled the hell out of? You know, why? And it just seems that like I can think of very, very few instances where these massive levels of swelling fucking progressive political will results in some sort of reform that's like awesome. I can't think of one.
Yeah,
you know, I can think of people getting sacked, people getting fired, and some of those, you know, were probably good, but I can't think of like a policy that's come into it. I mean, maybe it looks like in France they're about to pass some policy that's going to basically make any sex with a child under 15 non-consensual. Now that seems like a good policy that just passed. So there's one. I can't think of an Australian example though.
Yeah, I would also touch on seeing the BLM movement in the States, in Canada, even in Australia. It got heaps of publicity. You would get so much performative energy, and good. There have been definitely some racial issues that have been overlooked. There are still definitely some racial issues now that need to be addressed, but there is some very, very obvious drivers of the racial inequality, and one of them is the war on drugs. Yeah, to what extent was the media discussion talking about a really genuine problem that was capable of solution? It was probably maybe 1%. Maybe you got a few states.
Who the hell knows?
I mean, maybe you got a few states in America who reformed marijuana laws, but it's like, but fucking in Canada, you had these marches in the town squares or whatever, like the major streets throughout the city, and you have Justin Trudeau participating in the march. There was a march about systemic racism and fighting the power, and literally the most powerful person in Canada is at the march. They're protesting against you. It's like you could be in there passing legislation that genuinely solves these problems and acknowledges it, but instead you attend the march.
Yeah, or we could, what
could happened after that?
Yeah, but we could be in Australia, for example. We could be, choosing to not pass these enormous tax cuts that are planned for the next 5 years and be grabbing all that money. This is in a world where there isn't infinite money, which apparently there is, but I don't know. Normally we're told there isn't, and there's all these trade-offs we need to make. And we could be choosing to pour shitloads of money into the disadvantaged community that is just always going to be over-policed, right? Like, so, for example, we could permanently raise the dole, God forbid,
Yeah.
And maybe that would create an environment where people would be just less exposed to criminality. God forbid we decided to participate in some major drug reform where...
Well,
but again, it's like, well, is there a single... Yeah. I don't think there's a single policy outcome, at least in Victoria, as a consequence of the Black Lives Matter. And what I'd also say is that a couple of months after he went and bulldozed the sacred birthing trees. So and I don't know how Daniel Andrews did. So I don't know, are they necessarily the same issue? Well, Indigenous Australians would absolutely probably say that it is. I don't want to speak for them, but they're certainly the community can't believe their fucking sacred sites being smashed for a highway.
Yeah. And just to provide some balance in that, I would say that if it's after having seen 12 months of government incompetence, that if we can starve them of tax dollars by tax cuts, I would say that's a good thing. But no, like there is a sense that I'm not giving those fuckers a cent. There is a sense that problems spoken about in the media are not at all aligned with solutions, and there's a complete disconnect in being performative on the one sense and appearing to be solving a problem and actually taking action to
exactly
address
right.
it.
So we're not so, and this is we're not saying that we're not in alignment with these issues. It's like we're just saying that there's that enormous disconnect, and it seems to again support the idea that media, regardless of how much it portrays itself as anti-establishment, doesn't seem to mobilize any establishment changing, except for the incredible amount of change it has seemed to generate in the representation of people in art. That seems to you cannot, you just like you're absolutely living under a rock if you think certainly as a musician, it's just it's non-stop in terms of the way it's been able to make changes in that field, and a lot of the good
As
thing
in
is
racial representation and gender representation in art. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, for sure.
And these people, do they happen to be from potentially middle class backgrounds and potentially close to the top of the hierarchy, or are we pulling these people out of housing projects and putting them on TV?
Yeah, so what exactly right? So it's changed the way art's made, and it's changed the way you bill, you book an act, and it's changed who gets funding and opportunities. But it definitely hasn't all of a sudden gotten all these poor disadvantaged people free music lessons and free painting lessons and all these extra scholarships, and gotten them out of abusive environments so they're in opportunities to make art, and all the rest of it. Correct. So look, I probably would say in I certainly think in 10, 20 years there's going to be a shitload more rock musicians that are female or trans.
Yeah, and if that hasn't trickled down effects, I think I'd
will
really
be.
love to touch on this in a completely other episode, but continue.
Anyway, all I'd say is it seems to have made really impactful changes in terms of at least the way art is made now, and what can be made and what can't be made, and how people and the way in which art is going to be consumed. But it's pretty sad that that's kind of all it's done, and maybe also it's probably created an environment where people's willingness to report abuse and be supported in that is, I think, changing too. I think there's like
that would be positive.
If you were to sit there,
I would say that.
Okay, I would say it's definitely positive. I think it's created, and any kind of abuse, racial abuse, sexual abuse, whatever. I think that has massively shifted and will keep getting better. But yeah, I don't think we've managed to get one single dollar out of the 1% and given it back to anyone.
Yeah. I mean, as soon as you have the slogans of grassroots movements being perfectly mirrored in the advertising slogans of the richest companies in the world, there's something that tells me that those companies aren't going to be paying for it.
So is there any? No, that's right. So is there any solution to, like, other than people deciding to not be so short-sighted and ultimately selfish, and that's really what manifests these issues that we prescribe to be issues with the media? Is that,
So is there anything we can do as people to meaningfully push the envelope on these issues?
Well, other than look, like, challenge yourself to be like, post being inspired and emotionally affected by a movement like Black Lives Matter, then like post that going, oh, what can I do? Or who should I be voting for? Or what should I read? What should I look at?
I just think that there would be that progress if I've never seen an activist class that implicitly and like subconsciously benefit so much from capitalism in my life. You know, the Instagram, the TikTok, the Amazon orders of amazing things for your house are so tied to people who are, you know, intensely capitalist at heart in their actions, and they don't really want the solutions that they articulate. I just think a lot of it, if it is a genuine interest, and if people did genuinely want to reform the system, and if people genuinely did want to pay more tax, I think it would be there. But I think so much of it happens to be performative. So much of it is driven by this, you know, this social media world that we live in of being perceived as doing justice rather than actually wanting to do justice. And I think if you could change that, if you could change those ratios, you might get some actual fucking solutions.
Yeah. So it doesn't have anything to do necessarily with Murdoch, you know? And I think like I
don't think so.
No. And I just think Murdoch just exploits this big, awesome well of human shitness to his advantage. You know?
Yeah.
And it's the human shitness that's, you know, and the antidote to human shitness is probably reflection, inquiry, meditation, broadening your perspective, thinking about, you know, future generations, thinking about equity, and not send. The first step's not trusting what you read online or in a a newspaper or on television. It's
whether it's the left-wing paper that owns 60% or the right-wing paper that owns fucking 70% of the media. I think it's a desire to free think, a desire to be independent of any institution, any ideology, any party, anything that puts you into some type of category. I think if people can freely think, if people can realize that the media is just entertainment packaged as news, and if people can realize that like real change happens through educating people about genuine issues and I guess, you know, somewhat asking your politicians to actually move that grain, or aligning the incentives for, you know, your Instagram post to actually policy being implemented. If people can understand like what actually pulls the levers of power, I think that's the recipe.
I think they're all insane.
And one final thing, if you enjoyed this episode, please spread the word and let your friends and family know about it. And also, if you haven't already, make sure you hit subscribe. And if you're watching on YouTube, hit the like button and notification bell. See you next time.